What we have actually already entered, as far as I understand, is the grand solar minimum. And I think laymen are perhaps to some extent aware that the sun has cycles, but then they are mainly aware probably of these small cycles that are 11 or 22 years. But this is something else. This is a bigger cycle. And what is it about? Can you tell the audience what this grand solar minimum is all about and what it's going to entail?
Well, pretty simple. If you look into all the information we have historically on the output of the sun, and the way you do that is by looking at the sunspot data. The sunspots tell a story. Now, you referred to the 11-year cycle. That is a half of a solar polar reversal. The full solar polar reversal cycle is called a Hale cycle, and it takes 22 years. And in that 22 years, north and south flip in 11 years, and 11 years later, it flips back. So the full solar polar reversal is a 22-year cycle. And in between, the half cycle is 11. And each cycle rises to a max and goes to a minimum. And at the max, they determine how many sunspots occur every so often. They give it a smooth number. And you can get a data set of sunspots that go all the way back to the 1700s. And then you can extrapolate a little further back than that, because people like Ben Franklin and others literally took hand notes on sunspots. So we can extrapolate back into the 1400s. And what you find is patterns. There seems to be a 100-year cycle of increasing and decreasing solar cycles, and then a bigger 200-year cycle. Now, this is, I'm just averaging. It's actually like 104 years or whatever it is. But there's an average 100-year maximum and minimum solar cycle, and then a bigger 200-year cycle. If we go back and look at the paleogeographic record, if we look at the proxy data of weather during the time, there's a direct correlation between low solar activity and the temperature. So the last time it was cold on Earth was referred to as the centennial minimum. It was a short minimum, and it occurred in the early 1900s for a couple solar cycles. They were very small, and it was very cold. If you go back to the 1800s, 100 years before that, there was a period called the Dalton minimum, where there were 3 solar cycles that were very, very low. And we have a very cold period for about 2 decades in the early 1800s that we refer to as the Dalton minimum. If you go back further than that, another 100 years, you're at 1700. Well, from 1300 to 1700 was a time period called the Little Ice Age, when continental glaciers grew and consumed entire villages. It's when the Renaissance occurred and the Enlightenment. So something is occurring in these cycles. When the sun goes quiet, the temperature goes cold. And we can also associate famines and droughts. There's extreme weather shifts during low solar activity. Now, we are in the lowest, the last 2 solar cycles are the weakest solar cycles in the last 200 years. They are exceeding the weakness of the centennial minimum, which is why we're seeing floods that are dating back to matching things in the early 1800s, because we're repeating the same exact type of cycles again now. And based on some of the work of Valentina Zarkova and other scientists that are trying to project this forward, what they are suggesting, and is the same thing we've been suggesting since the beginning of cycle 24. We've entered the next grand solar minimum.
What is cycle 24? Is that the cycle that the sun has been in lately?
We're in solar cycle 25 now. So the last solar cycle was the weakest in 200 years. And we were waiting for that as an expression of the beginning of the next grand minima. And this one appears to be as extreme as the Maunder minimum potentially, which will mean a prolonged period of cold, crop loss, famine, and just hard times on Earth, because it shifts between drought and deluge. And this has to do with increased cosmic rays, nucleating clouds in regions that didn't have that many clouds before. And if you flood an area here, what happens is you remove all the moisture from the system, so another area becomes exceptionally dry. So we've got these extreme climate shifts during these grand minimas that make it impossible for the normal type of farming we do. And so it gets very bad.
Yeah, and
But
the
then
Maunder
even-
minimum was around 1700. It's like 1680 to 1720 or something like that. And that what kind of temperature drop are we talking about there at that
It's
time?
not that extreme, and that's what gets people off guard. If you look at the paleogeographic reconstructions of the Maunder minimum, the most the temperature shifts is about 1.2 C.
Hmm.
So that's just a few degrees Fahrenheit on average in certain locations. It's not the whole globe. It's certain regions more affected than others. This has to do with weather patterns, not climate. So during these climate shifts, the weather pattern shifts because of the breakdown of the jet stream. It becomes loose. It becomes what is called meridional, where the jet stream starts making these huge loops up into the Arctic, down into the tropics. And then you have these extreme temperature fronts, like we call it a cold front, where on one side it's 90 degrees warmer than the other. And that's bad news. That's extreme lightning, that's extreme hail, tornadoes, and just a bad day.
Yeah, I think often people don't realize that, overall the global average temperature doesn't shift that much, but it is enough to change the growth of crops, to change insect populations, which then means that we have to shift and adapt. And one of the big problems here, right, is we have big agriculture growing so many of the crops. It's not localized or regionalized, and you can't adapt that quickly at all. But then, of course, as Diamond is pointing out, you also have all of these extremes. So, while it might be a global average temperature drop of only 1 degree C, but not only is that going to affect your crop production and your insects, but then you have the extremes on top of it.
And regionally, it might be 3 degrees, maybe, or 4.
Right.
Right.
And you're going to see those extremes like Mount Washington getting down to minus 108 Fahrenheit, which is...
I think Professor Zarkova said that, according to her assessment, this upcoming here, or actually current grand solar minimum, began in 2020 and it is going to last until 2053 or something. Is that correct?
I thought her entry date was like 2023, like this year, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, it was the half cycle of a cycle. I don't know why she picks it. It's arbitrary because you cannot determine the length of the grand minima until after the event.
Oh, yeah.
It has a starting and an ending, and you have to be away from it to be like, okay, it's here.
Mm-hmm. You can't see it when you're in the midst of it.
Right. Historically, it lasts between 4 solar cycles to 7. So between 44 and 80 years, that's the length of these grand minima in history.
Yeah. So what does all this mean for the whole climate discussion? I mean, we're talking about a drop 1.2 degrees C here, and in the climate discussion, they're talking about, this very big mainstream narrative about climate change. They're talking about we having the temperatures having increased by about 1.2 C since industrialization.
Since the coldest. That's incorrect.
I know,
since the coldest.
I know, you're right. Yeah, it's actually not until about 1980 you can talk about an extra add-on.
So they're a little disingenuous. It began as global warming, and then the shift occurred to climate change because they're well aware that this little bit of warming can be explained naturally. In fact, a large portion of scientists say that this is the natural climate variability. There's no evidence of anything catastrophic. They go back to the Younger Dryas event and they say, back here, it changed 18 C in 400 years. Yeah. That's a little different than what you're suggesting. We're all still here somehow. So therein is the problem. But Anders, it gets worse. The grand solar minimum is the least of our worries. We're also experiencing a magnetic excursion. And the magnetic field of Earth has been weakening since the turn of the 20th century. Since the early 1900s, the magnetic field has been weakening. We are now at a level that should be suggestive of a full-blown magnetic excursion because of the angle of the decrease. And if you look at the complete history of the last, let's say, 100,000 years of the field strength, we are entering the next excursion. And bad things happen on magnetic excursions, worse than simply it getting cold a degree. what happens during these excursions is more cosmic radiation rains in on Earth, and you have increased UVA and UVB. And in the last few years, there are several peer-reviewed papers that are associating these large mass extinctions in our past with these magnetic excursions. And a good example, the largest magnetic excursion in the last 100,000 years is the Lechamp. And we can pinpoint that to 41,500 years ago was the lowest field strength. This moment in geologic time corresponds with the extinction of multiple megafauna and Neanderthal, a hominid that lived on Earth. So at this magnetic excursion point, 41,005, we have a mass extinction of megafauna, and we have the elimination of a hominid, humans are megafauna, called Neanderthal. Now, that's not the most recent mass extinction is 12,900 years ago. Yeah. 12.8, 12.9. And that was much bigger than the Lechamp. Now, luckily, humans made it, but 60 to 65% of megafauna in the northern hemisphere,
especially in North America. Yeah.
Yeah, it was bad for North America.
Well, and then to aggravate that too, that we're experiencing grand solar minimum at the same time, right? You have less solar activity, which means that Earth's magnetosphere is weak and getting weaker because it is strengthened by solar activity. And so if the sun has an outburst, we're particularly vulnerable. And here we are at a point in history where our whole civilization is dependent on an electrical grid that could easily go down in such a situation. So it's kind of multifold what's happening. The potential effects are many.
So how will the world and society change in the coming decades because of all this, do you think?
Well, the biggest effect and the biggest danger is in just a very short period of time, the next solar cycle. We've studied some peer-reviewed papers. There are certain things that come out of the sun called coronal mass ejections. If they're aimed at Earth, we can get a geomagnetic storm here. The Carrington event is several of these shot at Earth over a period of time where the worst geomagnetic storm in recent history occurred. Now, luckily, there were very few wires on Earth, but the ones that were there were charged with electricity. They lit things on fire. The telegraph operators could operate their telegraphs without being hooked up to batteries. So this is some of the induction happening on the planet. If that were to happen today, back to the Stone Age.
It's a civilization-ending event.
You have 8 billion people that are looking in their cell phones for answers, and there's no electricity.
Yeah.
And so people will starve to death in mass because they don't know how to get clean water. That's the dumbest thing humans are going to do. They're going to drink dirty water. This kills off a huge portion of the population through dysentery in the very beginning stages of a grid down scenario. And we're going to know it's coming with the technology we have. We'll see a giant sunspot on the sun that we're monitoring. It'll shoot an X flare that we estimate to be X40. We'll have a few 12 hours, maybe 18 until it hits. And that's it. Then there will be no more stores. There will be no more fuel. No one's going to work.
It's catastrophic on several levels. There's the practical level, right? All of that stuff that Diamond was just talking about. And then there's the psychological level. Like, he mentioned everybody looking into their little phone squares for answers. Well, there's a lot of people on this earth that really don't know how to function with that little rectangle, and it's going to be blank. And that's scary. I mean, there's a lot of people that do not have a clue how to be resourceful. And that might be the biggest threat of all, right? To other people, like people who are hungry and freaked out, they're very, very dangerous.
So how much of this is known in the mainstream science, how much is known but they don't talk about it, or are they completely oblivious about this, or do quite a few scientists actually know what you're talking about, but they won't say it?
No, they do. I mean, tons of top scientists email me all the time. Thank you for what you're doing. I could never say this because they'll be fired from their job if they mention it. People will be like, what are you talking about? You're out. You're crazy. You're a conspiracy theorist. But in practical terms, if you knew something like this was happening and unfolding, would you not pump up fear in the population of climate change and it's all our fault. So when these things start to unravel, the people blame themselves. All the while, the powers that be are digging underground, stealing trillions of dollars and saying, oh, we don't know where that money went. And so they're just playing dumb.
Yeah, like what about these politicians, top politicians, people like Obama, who have multi-million-dollar properties on the beachfront? Like, if global warming is such a huge threat and sea level is going to come up so much, then why have they invested their funds?
Yeah, I know, and they all fly to Davos.
Right, and they all fly to Davos in their private jets and all of that. But you, surf, must do something else. You must flagellate yourself. You must blame yourself. And I really think that's a huge part of the equation, the psychological element of people guilting themselves about almost everything.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's on purpose.
If you like this video and other interviews and talks and stories on Mind the Shift, please like, share, and subscribe. And most importantly, become a patron. Click on the Patreon link in the description box if you're on the cell phone, or in the banner if you're on a computer. I appreciate all the support. It allows me to make more and better content. Thank you.